Wonderful to see so many people signed up for the latest webinar we're bringing to you today from Elemental. We have a fantastic panel, expert panel here today, and we're talking about how commercial buildings are going to work in the future in a zero carbon economy. So a bit of background, a bit of context before we introduce the panel, but the construction industry directly influences 47%, nearly half of UK carbon emissions. And what we're doing today is going to explore how commercial buildings can really be part of the solution rather than the problem when it comes to greenhouse gases and the climate impacts. So we're going to ask our esteemed panelists to offer their opinion on what technologies, what can make these buildings sort of a force for good in terms of their profitability, but as well as their impact on the planet. We're going to look at smart solutions and how we might pursue better sort of holistic performance, and also look at the wider trends around sort of climate tech and how we see these trends shaping the future. So delighted to welcome, we have Sonny Masero, who's Chief Strategy Officer at EVORA Global, Tom Hopton, who is a global leader for smart buildings and controls at Buro Happold, and Susanne Baker, who's Associate Director for Climate, Environmental and Sustainability at techUK. Welcome, thank you so much for joining. Let me start, let you guys introduce yourselves, but give you a question to kick around as you do so. So the first question really is, so what's it going to take for buildings, for commercial buildings to become part of the solution, not part of the problem of greenhouse gases and climate impact? And maybe I could ask Sonny to go first.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at EVORA Global. And I've been working in the field of trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in buildings for about 25 years, starting more with a focus on kind of development, planning and design, but more recently working with software technologies as well as other forms of clean tech, and then looking more and more at the investment world and how to direct more capital towards this objective of getting to net zero. And that's what we're really focused on at EVORA, working mainly with real estate and infrastructure investors who are very much looking at net zero carbon as a target and broader kind of ESG priorities. And what I would say is that I, having worked in this field for so long, been kind of party to some highs, but a lot of lows when it comes to kind of progressing action on climate change. But what I've seen over the last 5 years, but in particular over the last 18 months, I think is a real change that does fill me with optimism, even though I know how slow the buildings market can change. But I do think that I'm optimistic about where we are at the moment for, three main reasons in terms of issues that are converging at the right time. One of the key things for me is the much greater increase of capital or finance into ESG or environmental and social priorities that we've seen over the last 18 months. So we've seen $1 billion of green bonds issued to fund a transition to be more green. The FT is now forecast that this year there'll be another half a trillion issued this year alone of new finance, and that's in addition to a massive shift in investment into ESG funds, new other financial instruments like green loans linked to sustainability outcomes. So that financial imperative is really positive, I think, despite all of the challenges that we've seen over the last year with COVID. The second thing is the science and the clarity around what we need, what is happening in terms of climate change, but also very clearly what we need to do. And I think we do know what we need to do, particularly within the buildings community, to get to net zero. And we know the time scale that we've got to do that to protect people on this planet. And the next, from starting now, which is already too late, the next 10 years really count. So whilst we talk about net zero carbon in 2050, we need to be over halfway there in the next 10 years. And that's a big ask, particularly when you think about the existing stock of properties, which in 10 years is not going to change significantly. So we can't just talk about net zero new buildings. It has to be about retrofitting the existing stock. And then the third thing for me is public opinion. I do think public opinion has shifted. I remember when I left university 25 years ago and decided to go into this field, a lot of my friends were asking me why would I bother spending my time doing this? Now I think finally my time has come. Our time has come to make a change, and I think the market is with us. So that's why I'm feeling optimistic that that buildings are going to change and change quite rapidly. And the commitment, we're seeing the commitments to get to net zero appearing every day, and we're seeing the plans coming through to back that up. Brilliant.
Okay, thanks for that sort of great context and some big numbers meeting the big challenge. I'll go to Tom next, and then Susanne. I know we're all in sort of lockdown and homeschooling modes, as well as looking after the planet. We have to look after the future of our children as well. But Tom, maybe you could introduce yourself next and your background.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As Ben introduced, I'm Tom, and I lead our smart buildings and controls team, based in the UK, but we operate all over the world, really. And just to pick up on one of your points, Ben, about that kind of holistic approach to building performance, and you know, considering that that does include energy, yes, and it's about 40% of energy that we put into buildings is simply wasted. But it's also about space. Space is underutilized in the built environment. We're certainly realizing the extremities of that right now. But also, building performance is about operations, how effective and efficient our facilities maintenance teams are, and other operations in the built environment. Mm-hmm. And they're all bottom line impacts on the business and our environment. But we shouldn't forget the core function of a building, why a building exists in the first place, and that's to accommodate us, to create an environment where we can thrive, help us be more productive, and enrich our experience of the built environment. And so, there are many aspects of building performance, and it's about increasing a building's yield, as well as lowering your bottom line impacts. It's essentially getting more from less.
Yep. And on that, we're going to, and Sonny mentioned particularly, the importance of the challenges around sort of retrofit and our current sort of building stock. Susanne, would you comment, what are the, particular retrofit challenges and a perspective perhaps on how they might be overcome? And we can get into some more questions there.
Okay, yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susanna Baker, and I work for techUK. If you don't know who we are the UK Trade Association for companies operating in the digital economy. And part of my work is really working with government, regulators and industry sectors as they are looking at their own net zero transitions and the role that digital technology can play into that. So we've been most active, I would say, in the energy and mobility space, less so, I think, on buildings, but that's certainly changing. And I think on the retrofit, I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has. I would certainly agree with some of the points others have made around the investment environment being right. But I think equally, there is an opportunity from digital technologies, and particularly the liberalisation of energy data that we're currently seeing being driven through the energy market. So by opening up new energy data safely, we think this is going to stimulate some really interesting business models that will unlock new ways of doing things, and will definitely help meet some of these retrofit challenges. So, for example, instead of just buying gas, we buy heat as a service. It's probably not so much applicable to some of the larger commercial buildings, but I'm thinking commercial buildings where SMEs are housed, where they may not have the kind of technological and expertise really to make the right investment decisions, really unsure about how on earth they're meant to be dealing with low carbon heat. And by kind of reverting the business model, so we buy heat as a service, we can start to take away some of those problems. So the Energy Systems Catapult has done some really interesting work, and this is in the consumer heat as a service space. But that still looks really promising, because people don't really care about which system or device delivers heat. They just want to be warm and comfortable at a price that they can afford. So by providing data on the usage of heat within a space, the service provider can start to really understand the energy buyer, and can provide a service that really helps, will enable them to pick the very best low carbon system for their situation, help them prepare so that it's easy to install when they're able to. And that provides much more confidence about switching to low carbon heating systems, and takes away these complicated investment questions, and provides that simplicity to the end users. So I think this as a service movement has got to be absolutely central to removing the complexities around the retrofitting of buildings, particularly in the low carbon heat space.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to move on. I do just want to say to people in the audience as well, actually, very happy to take some questions from yourselves and pose them to the panelists. So do use the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on the recording to pop those through, and we'll feed them into the panelists as we get them during this sort of hour. So some interesting points about new business models. Susanne's sort of making there. Sonny, I'm going to come to you next. What about sort of, how does policy perhaps need to evolve along with this? How might, different approaches perhaps stimulate different responses and enable different things, and also I think you've got some experience and some knowledge of other European countries and how they might handle this as well.
Sure, happy to touch on that. Just before I do that, I'd be interested in views from the floor on how they've seen changes in technology adoption over the last year. So with COVID, obviously people haven't been in the office, but there has been a much more of a focus on safety in the workplace. And from what I've seen, that's focused a lot on kind of very visible measures like hand sanitizer or increased cleaning rotas. But there is technology, particularly smart buildings technology, that can help operate buildings better, particularly the HVAC systems from an indoor air quality point of view, and that can also have a knock-on impact, a positive knock-on impact in terms of emissions and energy consumption. But I haven't seen the adoption of that technology grow in the way that I might have expected as a result of COVID, to prove that these workplaces are safe to go back to behind the scenes. So I'd just be interested in any views from the floor of whether they've seen changes from that point of view, just to try and prompt that conversation. And I do think so just linking to that and onto policy. I mean, policy does have a role to play in driving the adoption of some of the changes that we need. And I think it's interesting that we're seeing kind of contrasting approaches. So if you look at the UK, we have the minimum energy efficiency standards and the expectation now that we will be moving towards B ratings for energy performance certificates for EPCs. But the model that we've taken in the UK is that is a kind of modelled picture of energy performance. It's not necessarily based on actual energy consumption. Whereas in France, the legislation there, and in New York, it's based on actual energy consumption, and in New York, it's based on actual emissions. And that needs to be reported for properties. And for me, that could drive a different type of behaviour. For instance, if you think about smart buildings technology, if you implement that in a building to reduce energy consumption and reduce emissions towards net zero, it doesn't necessarily make a difference to your EPC rating. Whereas in France or in New York, it'll make it very visible, because your bills will be lower as a result of that. So I think we need to be aware of how those different approaches to net zero carbon policy is driving different behaviours. I mean, in the UK, we are seeing the policy changes that are driving towards increased electrification in properties, already making differences in terms of how decisions are made. So, for instance, whether a CHP plant is appropriate for a large commercial building, or whether you need to be using heat pumps and full electrification. That's already starting to happen. I know those conversations are happening. So it does make a difference. But it's got to be coupled with the technology to support those changes. But that is going to be needed, particularly for the retrofit market, because I think a lot of those conversations are happening for new build, and we're seeing a lot more claims for net zero new build. We're not seeing so many for the existing building stock on the commercial or the resi side, even though, you know, in 10 years' time, that will still be over 90% of the stock.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Sonny. Tom, did you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sonny. You know, I think there's a lot of effort to kind of make policies around new buildings. I think there's a lot of effort to, you know, steer and incentivize the physical technology that we put in buildings. You know, the renewable technologies, the air and ground source heat pumps, but less stimulus around the digital technologies. You know, you mentioned, Sonny, the building management systems and how you might optimize that during COVID. I would personally like to see more policy to stimulate that area, and it is a growing industry. You know, we've seen you know, huge growth over the last 5 years around that building management analytics, optimization of what you currently have, and there's some really high returns on investment for clients that are looking to lower their carbon emissions, but also do that in the most economic way, using the data, the infrastructure that they currently have. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'd like to see more focus on how rather than what, and particularly in existing buildings. You know, how we connect these existing buildings to digital infrastructure and a marketplace that can deliver this optimization in the short term, but also give us insights on how we might drive policy in the future, you know, towards that longer 5, 10 year, 20-year objective of zero carbon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And I think we're expecting a strategy, I think, from the government this summer, or before the summer, hopefully, on commercial energy efficiency. So, Susanne, what do we need to see from that strategy? What are the policy levers that you think can make the biggest difference?
I think Sonny and Tom have highlighted a couple of really important areas, and actually that kind of dynamic link to EPCs and financial products, I think, is something that the Green Investment Council is becoming increasingly interested in and exploring how they might link the two, and they're looking at emerging technologies to help them get that more accurate performance data that Sonny suggested was much more readily available overseas. So I think that is definitely going to be an area of focus. But I think for me, it still comes down to the investment environment. I mean, we've seen big moves over the last few months in trying to unlock private investment and finance in the residential space with that huge cash injection via the Green Home grants. That was part of the economic stimulus that the Chancellor announced last year. And that also came alongside £1 billion for public sector buildings. But it's trying to get those incentives for retrofitting commercial buildings right. The landlord-tenant issue remains a huge challenge, and policy has got nowhere near trying to solve how you might address that. So we desperately need a mechanism to overcome these split incentives. And whether, and I think the kind of link between EPCs and financial products is potentially one way to try and address that. You know, but we have to also balance that with fairness as well. But I don't think it's insurmountable. And then going back to the kind of point I made earlier, I think the liberalisation of energy data and innovative business models in the energy space, you know, has a really important role to play. So I think I'd like to see the strategy being tightly linked to the energy white paper that emerged just before Christmas, and because increasingly that distinction between buildings and energy is becoming increasingly blurred, I would argue, and actually we're seeing this merging of different kind of previously quite distinct areas and systems becoming one system of systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jane, can I just add to that?
Please do, yeah.
I think one organisation to look at in terms of work that's connected to what Susan's mentioned is the Better Buildings Partnership, because I think and in particular the 25 real estate firms that signed up to their climate change commitment, which is essentially saying they're committing to get to net zero carbon by 2050 or before then. For some of them, they've also committed to publish their pathway for getting there, which you've probably seen issued over the course of this year. But if you look at the detail of that commitment, that they have taken responsibility for tenant emissions as well. And that's the first time a lot of them have, well, probably all of them have done that publicly. And they've also taken responsibility for embodied carbon in major retrofits, as well as new builds. And that's not it is a significant undertaking on both parts. So there is going to be a change, I think, in that landlord-tenant dynamic. It's still going to be hard. And one thing that we're doing at EVORA is looking very much at how do you get access to tenant data, because that's not easy, and it hasn't been for a long time, the whole time I've been working in this field. But it is being asked for now, and I think that will change the dynamic. And I think the other thing that we've heard mooted by the government is the potential for a shift to operational rating. So moving away, or not necessarily moving away, but in addition to what EPCs do in terms of modelled energy consumption, looking at a scheme like Neighbours, which the BBP, the Better Buildings Partnership, have brought to the UK from Australia, where it does look at actual energy consumption, and it's been very popular as a scheme in Australia with investors, because it does make operational performance very transparent, and where that has been done and the high star rating Neighbours buildings in Australia have shown a very close correlation with investment outperformance. So it can be tied to financing, as Susanne suggests.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. And just moving as well from some of the policy related questions, just to provide some more, maybe if we can, sort of practical examples, and to talk about like how can tech actually really make buildings more profitable, but also sort of more resilient. I don't know, Tom, maybe if you can share any practical sort of examples here that we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge potential for technology in the environment. As an industry, we're lagging behind so many other industries in our, move towards a digital future. Mm-hmm. And we've worked on projects in the past, one recently that comes to mind, where we went back into a building 2 or 3 years after it was completed, an extremely well run building. The FM team there were, they had great facilities. It was extremely high performing building. It was in the top 3% of similar buildings of its type. But we took the data out of that building. We had a look at it in an almost forensic fashion, using new technological tools to go and hunt for patterns in the data that might find the ceiling of optimization. And that generated savings for the client of nearly 100,000 K per year. It reduced carbon by 10%, which was equivalent to the carbon sequestration of the local forest lands by about 1,000 acres. So huge potential, even with relatively modern buildings, to deploy these new technologies and really optimize a built asset. And that's with a building that is 2 or 3 years old, which is well managed. You apply that same model to our existing building stock, which we all know is extremely inefficient and aging and needing a replacement, then it just identifies the waste in our industry. And that's the real challenge that we need to overcome. It's the big elephant in the room. What do we do with our existing building estate?
and I'm going to ask you, this is one of my questions, I'll bring it forward, but one wish, like how do we overcome that waste? What would be, something that you wish we could do if you could wave a magic wand at the moment? I don't know if Susanne, if you've got an answer for us.
I would just like to, if I could just go back to the kind of question that you posed, Tom. I've got a perspective to kind of give on that, because I mean, we did some work with Deloitte last year to really understand the role of digital technology in enabling carbon reductions across the economy, and we looked specifically in the UK at what was the potential today with technologies that had already been deployed. And they estimated at kind of economy-wide that we could cut around 200,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide between now and 2030 if we rolled out smart technologies into buildings. So that was things like energy management systems and automated lighting, heat and aircon systems, smart thermostats and the like. But I think kind of my wish is actually if we could, if we could see into the future, we would actually unlock a much more dynamic role of buildings, where buildings are not just static off-takers of energy, but are active participants in a future energy system, storing, generating and selling off excess energy and responding to dynamic price signals in the market. And it kind of goes back to that point around, the lines between energy and buildings becoming kind of increasingly blurred, where buildings can be part of our future energy system, and in doing so can be, potentially more profitable and support a kind of much more affordable transition to a low carbon economy. But that's obviously going to be difficult. So I would prefer if we could fast forward to when that's a reality. But I think there's so much potential there.
Okay, and we're going to go to some questions from the audience soon, but I've got one or two more. But I don't know, Sonny, if you'd like to sort of comment on that challenge with your wish, or also to talk a little bit about kind of how we see this path towards net zero. If you had one wish to really say that how we're going to actually meet this massive goal, what's the kind of biggest thing that we need to perhaps overcome?
One wish.
Couple of questions.
It is. I mean, I as I said, I mean, I'm feeling more positive now than I have been in terms of the transformation that's required. I mean, I think in terms of a wish, the recognition of what goes on inside a building and making that as transparent as possible will make a change. And the things that we've been talking about, such as getting smart technologies into the buildings, such as the operational ratings and connecting that through to the finance, will make the difference. And that is, I mean, rather than having one wish, I think I'm seeing that happen already. My wish would be, I guess, that moves much faster because we're already behind, and we've got a long way to go in terms of the existing building stock that we've spoken about. And I think, on the one side, that's being pushed down through the investment community, and I see a question in the chat about TCFD. TCFD, I think, is a good example. TCFD is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure initiative, which came out of work was being done by Mark Carney and others in 2015 when he was governor of the Bank of England, and he's continued in terms of trying to transform the financial system with the principal aim that every financial decision has climate risk considered in it. And TCFD is trickling down through the investment community and into real estate. It's been more focused on equities, but is starting to have an impact in alternative asset classes like real estate. But I think there is still a gap around data between those investment decisions and the changes that have been made in the buildings. And I think there is a need for that top-down pressure to continue, but I also think there is a bottom-up need for building professionals to better understand what the owners of a property want to do with that property, or what they can do with that property within their investment strategy. And what I mean by that is, I've been involved in numerous conversations with architects and designers, as well as with FM and building operators. And very rarely does it have a clear understanding of what the investment strategy is for that property. So is that property being held for a long period of time, or is it just being held for 2 years? And therefore, suggesting a massive retrofit program that will get it to net zero in 10 or 15 years is not going to wash with a 2-year hold period. Maybe a smart building technology like building optimization, like Tom mentioned, you could get that through the door and in and deliver 10% savings, maybe 30-40%, depending on the property. That would wash. But if it's short-term hold, you're much more limited. If it's a core rather than an added value asset, again, you'd get a different response to an investment program that you're proposing. So for building professionals to have that understanding of the investment objectives, I think is really key in moving this agenda forward, as well as the change that's coming down and the restructuring that's taking place within the financial sector.
Okay, and with that, we are going to segue into some questions that are already coming through from you all. Do feel free to keep sending them in. So I'll just read out that question for the purpose of all the audience. So from Jeremy, who's mentioning that the TCFD, do you think that new TCFD reporting requirements will force asset owners and managers to establish new data standards to make this easier for investors to monitor progress? Sonny, did you want to add anything else on that question? Or,
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think on the point around new data standards, there is a lot of work to be done there. I think part of the issue that's not moving as fast as we might like is that the one gap around TCF. So companies are disclosing against TCFD, which means they are disclosing how are they considering climate-related risks, and that can be physical risks like extreme weather events, but it can also be transition risks. So transition risks are, what are the risks to a property of new legislation that may limit carbon emissions, for argument's sake, and how exposed is that property? So they are disclosing on that, but what's weak at the moment in terms of that disclosure is the impact that climate risk has on future strategy. So how is it going to restrict a real estate company's ability to create value in that new policy regime, or with those new more frequent extreme weather events? Once that starts to happen, it will need to be measured. So how can that progress towards that strategy be measured? And therefore the data standards need to emerge that can be integrated with those kind of strategic investment decisions. But there are important initiatives like GRESB, which is establishing a data set around performance and action on climate risk and resilience. But that is a relatively closed data set, but it is the go-to standard at the moment. But there needs to be a connection between that and the work that's going on at a kind of corporate entity level, where there is a lot of attempts at the moment to try and standardize those reporting frameworks and what the data standards might be for the exchange of data between investors.
Mm-hmm. Susanne?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this question, if that's possible. I think there's another driver as well around standardization of the data, and that's the kind of development of digital twins. So for those that aren't familiar with digital twins, they're essentially virtual representations of real-world assets, processes, and systems that draw on integrated technical capabilities to really enhance decision making, drawing from existing data sets and basically allowing analytics and simulations to be performed. And the Centre for Digital Built Britain, which is a partnership between the University of Cambridge and Bayes, is working on a world-leading national digital twin program to really understand how the construction and infrastructure sectors could use digital twins, but basically better to design, build, operate, and integrate the built environment. Really building on the on BIM data to create a series of interconnected twins. The work that they're doing at the moment is actually on a information exchange management, information management framework, which will essentially allow that kind of interoperability of different data sets to allow this digital twin to come into being. And I think this is going to become kind of increasingly significant given the complexities of the net zero transition. Because I mean, we're hearing so many people calling for a systems approach to planning for net zero, and really digital twins is one way to help us do that. The simulation models as well can also help us essentially kind of stress test for the changing climate and extreme weather conditions. So we think that digital twins could actually be a proof point for investors in future to demonstrate kind of how infrastructure is working to become more resilient to a changing climate. But I mean, obviously, it's still very embryonic days, but we're seeing kind of huge levels of ambition around the use of digital twins in the climate context. And in the UK, that the focus is at the moment all on built infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Tom, did you want to comment briefly on that before we move on to the other questions?
I'm glad Susanne brought up digital twins. You know, there's huge potential for this, and I think the problem that we face is a problem compounded by the fact that we don't have a good picture of it. And so we need to expose the data from buildings, and we need to use that data in clever ways to look at our options and simulate the result. And I think the future has to be that buildings are connected in a wider digital infrastructure. You know, we need to do the energy management piece from buildings to buildings as well as within a building itself. And one of the challenges I see coming forward is that the real estate industry is complex. You know, we've got disparate buildings, disparate systems, disparate data, and that's a legacy problem that we're going to need to overcome. So, the digital building framework is much needed, but we also need some standardization, and we need the how to leverage the value that will bring.
And just a very quick comment from all the panelists, if you like, or if anyone would like to comment on the building passports idea Jeremy's putting forward there. Would building passports that capture the life cycle of a building make this easier?
Yeah, I'd
yes
love
or no?
to talk
yeah.
on this one. EVORA, we've created a building passport with ESG data in it, so that to enable that data to be easily transferred or shared within a transaction. We are testing. I mean, that's one interpretation of a building passport, I should say, because it does mean a lot of different things to different people. And if you think about it in digital twin terms, you know, the digital twin could provide the basis for a digital passport. But at the moment, I haven't seen digital twins be taken from being used in design and construction into operation, where they should be used and have continued value. And I think if you can take that design tool and construction tool into something that is linked to operational data, then you know, a number of the things that Tom and Susanne has been talking about will come into being and have a real impact, but not in terms of just net zero carbon, but also in terms of health and well-being of people in the buildings. And then building passports are also used for other things. There's a great new startup that's using that principle for fire safety as well. So I just want to be clear, there are different interpretations of building passports, but getting good data, for instance, during the due diligence process for a property acquisition is hard. It's not as forthcoming as you might imagine, which is one of the reasons that we've created the passport that we have, to try and make that an easier process, so that if you think about the investment cycles, part of the risk and going back to TCFD and climate risk, part of the risk is that there is policies that are coming into being and targets that are being set for 10 years time. So, you know, the EU is talking about a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. And if you think that could be, you know, 2 investment cycles, it could be less, and it could be more if you only got a 2-year hold period, but it's going to come around very quickly is my point. And you know, it's one thing trying to change the existing assets that you have, and some may or may not have the budget or the capital allocated to do that. But what property owners need to be thinking about, and they are, is how do you stop kind of poor performing properties coming in to your funnel of assets, and that needs to be stopped or needs to be understood at the point of due diligence, because that's when you can make the decision of either this property is poor performing and we know what the cost is of improving it to get to net zero or on the way to net zero, and we know how much it costs and that's acceptable, or we say no, that's not something that this our investment strategy can respond to. And that's got to happen now, because I know that there are property owners now that are looking to dispose of assets which they know are not good performers and are going to be expensive to transform, and there is a chance that other investors could inherit those assets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course. Okay, let's take another question now from the audience. This one's from Robert Swan, talking about the significant change that we're going to have to do to get to 2050 targets. So, do the panel feel that the occupation and use styles will have to change significantly, you know, to halve energy use in the next 10 years? Where do we see that paradigm shift to reach 2050 targets? You know, bearing in mind everything to date seems to be it's quite tactical, short-term, short ROI periods rather than the development of perhaps longer-term strategies. Would anyone like to volunteer their virtual hand for this one? I
mean, I can talk to
Go for it, Tom.
I'm not sure I can give.
Susanne breathes a sigh of relief. No, she's
the full answer, but yeah, I think we're currently living through a paradigmatic shift in the way that we use buildings right now, and I think as we come out at the end of that, you know, there'll be a legacy of COVID. I think we all recognise that, you know, after COVID, there's the economic downturn, and then beyond that, there's the climate crisis. And as an industry, the built environment is quite susceptible to, you know, these changes. And so we need to make better use of our built environment. I think there will naturally come about a shift where we have different use cases sharing the same building. You know, shared space has got to be a you know, a dominant feature as we move forward. So I think there are going to be some shifts. Will the climate agenda drive that? I'm not so sure. I think economy might drive it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Susanne?
Yeah, sorry, I've got kids at home, so that's why I was breathing a sigh of relief, because they're having a bit of an argument. But I mean, look, this is going to require changes in every section of our society and the way that we live and run our lives. And I think what's promising is the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations just before Christmas. You know, that's, you know, it's for the first time for the, you know, the UK has led the world in being able to develop, you know, the starter at least of a plan of how on earth we're going to reach net zero.
You just put yourself on mute.
Sorry.
Susanne, sorry.
Some of the behaviour changes that we're likely to require are going to need a completely different way in which we think about policy traditionally. BEIS have recently established a behaviour change policy unit. I mean, they've only been in operations, I think, since summer of last year, but I think their role is going to be increasingly important as we move forward, and some of the low-hanging fruit have been plucked. I think that's when we start to get into really challenging territory. And actually, that's, I think, the biggest challenge for every sector's net zero transition is accommodating for that behavior change. And actually digital technologies and smart technologies have an absolutely vital role to play in actually automating some of that behavior change. So, we're not relying on people to change absolutely everything, but we can automate what we can. I think behavior change is the big one.
Particularly coming out of COVID, could be very interesting what behavioural changes sort of last.
Absolutely.
Whether we are going back to the office, whether we're going to have to keep heating the office, but just for half the people. I don't know. And Sonny, you were going to make a point there. Was this about perhaps the length of time horizon and that challenge?
It was, still responding to Robert's question. It's about being more forward-looking as well, because I think the shift that we've seen, and TCFD, I mention it again, has been a key in this. A fundamental requirement of TCFD is to be forward-looking in terms of understanding what the climate risk is going forwards and what that means for businesses. And if you think about ESG investment, traditionally it's been more preoccupied with kind of what's happened in the past year and reporting and disclosing on that. Whereas what TCFD is doing, and this is going to be reinforced by the new disclosure regulations coming from the EU, well, at least for companies in the EU and funds in the EU, it will be forcing those companies to look ahead, and I think that does change the mindset or start to shift the mindset from what Robert's rightly identified as being quite short-termism and tactical. Obviously, that's not going to happen overnight, and underlying that change in perspective, there needs to be the systems and data in place to enable investment decisions to be nudged in the right direction from a climate change point of view. But that is happening. I've had a number of conversations with asset and fund managers over the last 6 months who are brand new to ESG and not the people that I'm used to talking to from the ESG perspective. And that they know that ESG and net zero carbon is now on their agenda. And if they want to get access to capital for their funds and assets, then they need to be doing something about it. And they're looking for help. So that is happening. And as I said, not as fast as any of us would like, but the change is afoot.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answers some of Robert's question. Let's go to another one. Amrit Pal is asking here about domestic dwellings, but we'll try and broaden it out to commercial because that's sort of the focus of this, if possible. About a shift from natural gas. What impact will a shift from natural gas to hydrogen potentially have on buildings? On buildings, would mass retrofits of domestic boilers or heating be a massive investment? Should new builds start to include allowances for these sort of retrofits now? Or maybe we could broaden out some of the points or comment specifically on hydrogen. Susanne?
Well, I'll go back to the point I made as around the heat as a service business model as a way to overcome the kind of huge challenges of getting at least the in-house infrastructure in place. But I think it's the Aldersgate Group have done some really interesting analysis looking at some of the big technological changes that have occurred in recent times and the speed at which we're able to do that when our minds are focused. And one of the examples that they pointed to was, in fact, the rollout of gas boilers, which was done in an incredibly short period of time, relatively speaking. I do think in the UK, the gas boiler industry has been, very effective lobbyists within government. But I think it's clear that the commitment to ground source heat pumps and the like in Boris's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which kind of came out, I think, in October last year, maybe November. That commitment to ground source heat pumps really does show that along with hydrogen, there is this commitment to moving away from fossil fuel gas for heat. It's going to be really interesting to see how this is going to play out. We've obviously got new commitments on hydrogen in the Energy White Paper and again in Boris's 10-point plan. Whether we can get the hydrogen infrastructure in place everywhere in time, I think remains to be seen, but we're certainly really keen to see the development of the supply chain first and foremost, and the basic infrastructure before perhaps we need to start well, we need to think of it concurrently, but certainly we need to be thinking about buildings being ready for hydrogen and for alternative heat options, and perhaps, you know, going back to heat as a model that provides that flexibility to allow energy service providers to adapt the solution to where people are based. Yeah, removing more complexity out of the system that then needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Susanne.
Just on massive kind of retrofits for domestic for homes. I mean, I think just to call out to the work that kind of that Russell Smith and the team at Parity Projects are doing, kind of modelling and delivering what's possible in terms of retrofits. They've now got a piece of software that enables you to model out across a portfolio what can be achieved. But I think there is a question about hydrogen and whether hydrogen is best used for domestic heating, rather than, you know, more intensive industrial uses where it might be better placed, and industries like steel, which are harder to decarbonize through electrification. I mean, there's a lot of expectation that in homes and other buildings that we'll see a greater use of electricity and heat pumps and you know, novel battery storage technologies than perhaps a switch to hydrogen. But it's still all up for grabs, and you know, hydrogen is only green if it's produced in the right way. So I think there is a lot of hype around the potential for hydrogen, both in terms of its greenness and where it can be applied. But I think it does have a role to play for decarbonising building materials, because we haven't really talked about embodied carbon, but that is an area that's getting increasing scrutiny, and that could be one of the solutions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, there's a couple of just more sort of tactical questions we might just try and tick off quickly. If that's all right. One's from Tim Fenn. Does the panel think the passive house standard should be mandatory for all commercial buildings? Anyone like to take that? The passive house standard, Sonny?
I can have a go. I think operational ratings of buildings should be mandatory because that tells you how a building is actually performing in use. I do have some reservations around design standards that don't go into operation, and that's not criticism of a passive house. That's just a general kind of point about the obsession with design certifications when there's not a correlation with how a building is actually performing in use, whether that's from an environmental point of view or from a health and well-being point of view.
Yeah, Tom, did you want to comment on that, or just agreement with Sonny?
Yeah, just completely agree with Sonny. We need to move to an actual measured consumption model, right?
Okay. I'm going to move on to the question from Vikram then here. Say, this is about the challenges of implementing some sort of like digital twin, or there's a BIM model. So always here, constantly updating the BIM model to keep up with the changes in the building, along with the cost of maintaining the licenses for the model or the passport or whatever it is that we're putting in, is potentially a deterrent for these types of digital twin initiatives. Don't know, Susanne, would you sort of like to comment on that? How can we get over that one?
So I think, yeah, no, you make a very good point. And obviously we've got to try and make sure that it's as cost effective as possible. But if investors are demanding this information, then I think the kind of broader benefit of investing in your data becomes much more apparent. So I think there was a comment also that actually perhaps digital twins may play also an increasingly important role in the insurance industry, and you could well see that being the case. And we know, for example, the European Commission at the moment is this year starting work on something called Destination Earth. It's Ben, I mentioned it to you before the call, but it's essentially a digital twin of the Earth, incorporating natural environment data to understand and better plan for climate change and understand the health of ecosystems. So I don't think that this will go away. I think we need to find perhaps the right arguments really, and the incentives to invest in quality data, because I think the benefits of getting our data sets right are absolutely massive on a systems basis. Whether that means making this requirement of this data mandatory, or whether you link it to your financial incentives, I think is open to debate. But I think it's absolutely clear that it will be playing a much more increasingly important role in future.
Just to add to that, I mean, the term digital twin is poorly defined in industry at the moment. So I think the concept at its bare minimum is just putting your data in a central location and making it accessible. Now, deploying a digital twin is not going to suit every project. At the moment, it's only economical to do it on a large project or across a real estate. You wouldn't do it for the corner shop down the road, right? But the strategy for the corner shop down the road might be just to launder your data and put it somewhere where it is accessible. Now, I mean, I have a view that the government, there should be national infrastructure for where you put that data. It doesn't have to be stored on small to medium-sized projects. So yeah, I guess the message is define your objectives for a digital twin, and then that can shape the scope of a digital twin.
Okay. We're running out of time. I'm just going to ask us to sort of wrap up now with just perhaps one closing message. I don't know if each of our panelists want to leave you with one. What's the kind of one thing you'd love to leave, as if we're not going to remember anything else but one thing? Perhaps we could sort of summarize that and give you a little bit of time to try and think of it as a sort of closing message from our panel. I'd also love to just thank everyone for joining, for your questions. We got through a number of them there, but obviously if you feel free to sort of send any more in, and we can always get them back to you, and hopefully we'll see them again on some sessions soon. But perhaps just a closing message. Who would like to go first? Susanne? No? Came off mute there. Go on, go for it.
Yeah, all right. So I guess my closing message is that digital technologies are going to become have an important role to play in the transition of the building sector to net zero, and that should be definitely considered as part of your net zero transition strategy, and particularly the ability of digital technologies to unlock a richer source of data that could hopefully in future enable you to get better financial products and insurance services.
Okay, thanks Susanne. Tom, you ready there?
Yeah, I'll keep mine quite short. Look after your building data in the same way that you might look after your physical assets, because it's going to be invaluable in the future.
Great takeaway. Thanks very much, Tom. And Sonny?
I would just say, I think investors are going to be, and property owners are going to be more receptive to the net zero carbon agenda, particularly the more public property owners and investors who are under scrutiny. And I would just say, just because technology works well for a building, it doesn't mean that there is commercial demand for it, or it may not fit the investment or ownership strategy for that property. So anybody trying to promote those technologies for net zero carbon should be thinking about that context, and particularly the commercial context in which that technology has to sit and operate and deliver a return in.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Sonny, Tom, Susanne. That's brilliant. And thank you so much to everyone listening in for this hour. It will be available on the Elemental YouTube channel and our website shortly after, if you want to kind of catch up again. And hopefully see you all again soon. We have another one sort of same time next week in this series. But goodbye. Thanks, for now. Ben. Thank you very much.
Cheerio, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.